To comprehend the absolute, paralyzing shock that gripped the high command of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the late hours of June 19, 1944, one must embark upon a profound historical autopsy of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, an engagement that resulted in the catastrophic, unprecedented vaporization of over 400 Japanese naval aircraft in a single day. This event, forever immortalized in the annals of military history by the grimly colloquial American moniker, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was not merely a tactical defeat for the Japanese Empire. It was the violent, irrefutable termination of Japanese naval aviation as an offensive operational force. The sheer scale of the destruction, 400 highly complex flying machines and their crews annihilated within the span of roughly 8 hours, fundamentally shattered the carefully constructed illusions of the Japanese military apparatus. To fully understand how such an asymmetrical slaughter could occur, it is necessary to painstakingly dissect the intersecting trajectories of industrial capacity, pilot training pipelines, technological evolution, and strategic doctrine that had been diverging wildly between the United States and the Empire of Japan since the attack on Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years prior. By the summer of 1944, the strategic geometry of the Pacific War had shifted irrevocably against Japan. The United States Navy, fueled by an industrial mobilization of historically unprecedented proportions, had relentlessly pushed across the Central Pacific. The American objective was the Mariana Islands, specifically the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The strategic calculus regarding the Marianas was brutally simple and universally understood by both Washington and Tokyo. These islands fell squarely within the inner defensive perimeter of the Japanese Empire. More terrifyingly for the Japanese, the Marianas possessed large, relatively flat landmasses that were geographically perfect for the construction of massive airfields. If the United States captured these islands, they would position the newly developed, long-range Boeing B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, subjecting Tokyo, Yokohama, and the critical industrial centers of the empire to devastating strategic bombardment. The Imperial Japanese Navy High Command, led by Admiral Soimu Toyoda, recognized that the defense of the Marianas was an existential necessity. The loss of the Marianas would mean the inevitable loss of the war. Consequently, Toyoda activated Operation Ago, a massive, complex, and desperately ambitious strategic plan designed to lure the United States Pacific Fleet into a final, decisive battle, the Kantai Kessen, a Mahanian clash of armadas that the Japanese had been seeking since the beginning of the conflict. The instrument of this decisive battle was the first mobile fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. Ozawa was widely considered one of the most brilliant, intellectually capable, and tactically aggressive flag officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He commanded a formidable surface force built around 9 aircraft carriers, including the heavy fleet carriers Teiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, heavily screened by battleships, including the massive super battleships Yamato and Musashi, alongside numerous cruisers and destroyers. On paper, the first mobile fleet represented a massive concentration of naval power. However, beneath the impressive tonnage and the proud silhouettes of the warships lay a rot that had fundamentally compromised the combat efficacy of the Japanese carrier air groups. The aircraft embarked upon Ozawa's carriers, primarily the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, the Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bomber, and the Nakajima B6N Jill torpedo bomber, were technologically stagnant. While the Zero had been the undisputed master of the Pacific skies in 1941, possessing legendary maneuverability and range, it achieved these metrics through the absolute sacrifice of survivability. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating to protect the pilot. In 1941, flown by the pre-war elite veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this vulnerability was mitigated by sheer pilot skill. But by 1944, the vast majority of those elite, highly trained veterans had been systematically slaughtered in the grinding, attritional meat grinder of the Solomon Islands campaign, the Battle of Midway, and the defense of Rabaul. The men flying Ozawa's aircraft were hastily trained replacements. Due to severe fuel shortages caused by the relentless American submarine blockade, these new pilots had been rushed through shortened training programs, frequently sent to frontline carrier squadrons with merely a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had possessed. They struggled with complex fleet navigation, lacked the gunnery skills required for high-deflection shooting, and were utterly unprepared for the horrific, multi-dimensional chaos of modern fleet-level aerial combat. Arrayed against Ozawa's first mobile fleet was the United States Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man renowned for his cold, calculating intellect and unshakable strategic discipline. The offensive spearhead of the Fifth Fleet was Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force, commanded by the aggressive, brilliant naval aviator Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher. Task Force 58 was, quite simply, the most powerful naval armada ever assembled in the history of the world. It consisted of 15 aircraft carriers, 7 heavy fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, embarking a staggering total of over 900 combat aircraft. The technological and qualitative superiority of the American forces was absolute. The primary fighter aircraft of Task Force 58 was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Unlike the fragile Japanese Zero, the Hellcat was a massive, heavily armored flying tank powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine. It was explicitly designed by American aeronautical engineers using data gathered from captured Zeros to entirely negate the Japanese fighters' advantages. The Hellcat was faster, possessed a vastly superior rate of climb and dive, and was armed with 6 lethal 50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns. Crucially, the Hellcat was incredibly rugged, featuring extensive armor plating around the cockpit, bulletproof glass, and thick, self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb immense punishment from Japanese 20mm cannons and continue flying. Furthermore, the American pilots sitting in the cockpits of these Hellcats were the products of a massive, highly refined, and deeply resourced training pipeline. They arrived at the fleet with hundreds of hours of flight time, extensive gunnery practice, and a thorough understanding of advanced fighter tactics, particularly the Thatch Weave, a mutually supporting two-plane tactical formation specifically designed to destroy the highly maneuverable Zero. Beyond the overwhelming superiority of the American aircraft and pilots, the United States Navy possessed 2 revolutionary technological advancements that would transform the impending battle into a unilateral slaughter: advanced shipborne radar integration and the proximity fuse. By the summer of 1944, American aircraft carriers and their escorting cruisers and destroyers were equipped with highly sophisticated SK air search radars capable of detecting incoming enemy aircraft formations at distances exceeding 150 miles. However, radar alone was merely a sensor. The true American genius lay in the creation of the Combat Information Center, or CIC. Within the darkened, heavily compartmentalized CICs deep inside the American warships, Fighter Direction Officers, or FDOs, stared at glowing radar oscilloscopes. These highly trained officers acted as the tactical conductors of the aerial battlefield. Using highly secure VHF voice radios, the FDOs could process the raw radar data, determine the altitude, speed, and heading of the incoming Japanese strike packages, and precisely vector American Hellcat squadrons to intercept them at the exact optimal geographical point and altitude. The days of combat air patrols wandering blindly through the sky hoping to stumble upon the enemy were entirely over for the Americans. The second technological marvel was the Mark 53 proximity fuse, highly classified and colloquially known as the VT fuse. Embedded within the nose of the 5-inch anti-aircraft artillery shells fired by the American escort ships, the VT fuse contained a microscopic, incredibly ruggedized radio transmitter and receiver. As the artillery shell flew through the air, it constantly broadcasted a radio wave. If that wave bounced off the metal skin of an enemy aircraft and returned to the fuse, the internal circuitry would instantaneously detonate the explosive warhead at the optimal lethal distance, filling the sky with a devastating cloud of high-velocity steel shrapnel. Prior to the VT fuse, anti-aircraft gunners had to manually calculate the time of flight and set mechanical fuses, a highly inaccurate process that required thousands of shells to be fired to achieve a single hit. The proximity fuse increased the lethality of American anti-aircraft fire by an estimated factor of 5, creating an impenetrable, mathematically precise wall of explosive fragmentation around the American fleet. The tactical preamble to the slaughter began on the 18th of June, 1944. Admiral Ozawa, operating his first mobile fleet in the Philippine Sea to the west of the Marianas, possessed one significant tactical advantage: the range of his aircraft. Because Japanese planes lacked heavy armor and self-sealing tanks, they were significantly lighter than their American counterparts, allowing them to fly up to 300 miles to launch a strike, a distance roughly 100 miles greater than the maximum strike range of the American Hellcats and Avengers. Ozawa's battle plan relied heavily on this discrepancy. He intended to maintain a distance of roughly 300 to 400 miles from the American fleet, remaining safely outside the reach of American retaliation, while launching massive, coordinated strikes. Furthermore, Ozawa's strategy hinged upon a fatal, deeply flawed assumption regarding land-based air power. He believed that the American fleet had already been severely degraded by hundreds of Japanese land-based bombers operating from the airfields on Guam, Rota, and Saipan. He intended for his carrier planes to strike the Americans, sink the surviving ships, and then land safely on the Marianas airfields to refuel and rearm. The catastrophic reality, entirely unknown to Ozawa, was that Vice Admiral Mitscher had already unleashed the full fury of Task Force 58 upon the Marianas in the days prior, systematically obliterating the Japanese land-based air forces. The airfields on Guam were cratered ruins, and the promised hundreds of supporting aircraft had been reduced to burning aluminum wreckage. Ozawa was sailing into a trap, relying on an anvil that had already been completely shattered. On the morning of June the 19th, the trap violently slammed shut. Admiral Spruance, prioritizing the protection of the vulnerable American amphibious landing forces currently fighting a brutal ground war on the beaches of Saipan, issued strict orders to Mitscher to maintain a defensive posture, refusing to allow Task Force 58 to steam westward to hunt the Japanese carriers. This decision, intensely criticized by the aggressive Mitscher at the time, inadvertently created the perfect tactical conditions for the massacre. By remaining tied to the airspace around Saipan, the American fleet consolidated its massive defensive umbrella, forcing the Japanese to fly into the teeth of the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The engagement commenced precisely at 10 o'clock in the morning. The SK air search radar operator aboard the American battleship USS Lee suddenly detected an enormous, anomalous contact on his screen, a massive bogey, roughly 150 miles to the west, rapidly closing on the American fleet. Admiral Ozawa had launched his first massive raid, consisting of 69 aircraft, primarily Zero fighters, Jill torpedo bombers, and Judy dive bombers. Within minutes of the radar detection, the combat information centers across Task Force 58 erupted into a frenzy of highly coordinated, coldly efficient activity. The fighter direction officers immediately began vectoring the combat air patrol, dozens of Hellcats already circling high above the fleet, toward the incoming threat. Simultaneously, flight decks across the 15 American carriers became chaotic blur of spinning propellers and blue exhaust smoke as every available Hellcat was scrambled into the sky. Mitscher ordered all his bomber and torpedo squadrons to launch and orbit out of the way to the east, entirely clearing the flight decks to allow for the continuous, uninterrupted launching, recovering, and refueling of his fighter squadrons. The American strategy was brutally simple: establish a massive, multi-layered vertical wall of Hellcats between the Japanese strike force and the American ships. At a distance of roughly 60 miles from the American fleet, the interception occurred. It was not a battle in any traditional sense, it was an execution. The inexperienced Japanese pilots, exhausted from the long flight, flying in rigid, predictable formations, were suddenly ambushed by swarms of heavily armed Hellcats diving out of the blinding sun. The fighter direction officers had flawlessly positioned the American fighters at a significant altitude advantage. As the Hellcats plunged into the Japanese formations, the slaughter was instantaneous. The 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition fired by the Hellcats effortlessly tore through the unarmored, deeply fragile Japanese aircraft. A single, well-placed burst of fire into the wing root or the engine cowling of a Zero or a Judy resulted in an immediate, catastrophic explosion, transforming the aircraft into a plummeting fireball. The American pilots, highly trained in deflection shooting, ruthlessly picked apart the panicked Japanese formations. The Japanese pilots, lacking the experience to take violent evasive action or employ complex defensive tactics, simply flew straight into the incoming fire. Within a matter of minutes, the first Japanese raid was entirely decimated. Of the 69 aircraft launched by Ozawa, 42 were blown out of the sky before they ever saw an American warship. A mere handful managed to penetrate the fighter screen, only to be instantly obliterated by the terrifying, mathematically precise barrage of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire from the American escort screen. Not a single American ship suffered significant damage from the first raid. The utter futility of the Japanese attack was perfectly encapsulated by the famous, jubilant radio transmission of an American Hellcat pilot, Commander Paul Bowie of Carrier Air Group 16, who shouted into his microphone over the chaos of the dogfight, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The phrase immediately proliferated across the radio networks, giving the battle its enduring, grimly accurate title. Admiral Ozawa, completely isolated from the horrific reality occurring miles away and entirely unaware that his first strike had been vaporized, proceeded to launch his second, and largest, massive strike package. At roughly 11 o'clock in the morning, 128 Japanese aircraft launched from the decks of the first mobile fleet, swarming eastward toward the American lines. Once again, the incredibly powerful American SK radars painted the massive incoming formation while it was still over 100 miles away. The American fighter direction officers, now operating with the calm, practiced rhythm of an assembly line, stacked over 200 Hellcats in a massive, impenetrable vertical wall of steel and spinning propellers. They vectored the fighters to intercept the Japanese at different altitudes, ensuring that no enemy aircraft could slip through the net. The subsequent engagement was even more devastating than the first. The sky over the Philippine Sea became a surreal, terrifying canvas of burning aluminum and spiraling smoke trails. The American pilots reported that the sky was literally filled with falling Japanese planes, a continuous, horrific rain of flaming wreckage plunging into the deep blue ocean below. The inexperienced Japanese aviators, terrified by the sheer volume of American fighters and completely outmatched technologically, broke formation in sheer panic. They jettisoned their heavy bombs and torpedoes into the ocean in a desperate, futile attempt to gain speed and maneuverability, completely abandoning their offensive mission merely to survive. It was an aerodynamic massacre. Over 70 Japanese aircraft from the second raid were shot down in the span of 30 minutes. A small, desperate group of roughly 20 Japanese planes managed to break through the fighter screen and launch a disorganized attack on the American carriers USS Bunker Hill and USS Wasp. Their bombs fell wide, causing only minor shrapnel damage and a few casualties, a pathetic return on investment for the immense, staggering loss of life and machinery. The surviving remnants of the second raid, shattered and broken, turned back toward their carriers, leaving the ocean surface littered with hundreds of burning oil slicks and the bodies of the Imperial Japanese Navy's aviators. While the aerial massacre was occurring in the stratosphere, an equally devastating, stealthy catastrophe was unfolding beneath the waves, a catastrophe that would further guarantee the complete destruction of the Japanese naval aviation arm. American submarines, specifically the USS Albacore and the USS Kavala, had been meticulously tracking the massive Japanese fleet. As Admiral Ozawa's flagship, the newly commissioned, heavily armored fleet carrier Taiho, turned into the wind to launch its aircraft, the Albacore, commanded by Commander James Blanchard, slipped past the Japanese destroyer screen and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. One torpedo struck the Taiho squarely on her starboard side, rupturing aviation fuel tanks and jamming the forward elevator. Initially, the damage seemed entirely manageable, and the massive carrier continued flight operations. However, the Japanese damage control procedures were deeply flawed and ultimately fatal. An inexperienced damage control officer, attempting to clear the pervasive, highly explosive fumes of vaporized aviation gasoline that were filling the enclosed hangar deck, ordered the ship's ventilation system to be turned on full blast. This catastrophic error simply circulated the explosive fumes throughout the entire enclosed volume of the massive warship. Hours later, a random spark, perhaps from a generator or a dropped tool, ignited the vapor. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic, physically blowing the sides out of the massive armored carrier and causing it to sink rapidly, taking Admiral Ozawa's flagship and thousands of sailors to the bottom of the ocean. Merely hours later, the USS Kavala, commanded by Commander Herman Kosseler, penetrated the screen of the heavy carrier Shokaku, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, and slammed 3 torpedoes into her side. The Shokaku, already highly vulnerable due to burning aircraft on her flight deck, rapidly caught fire. The flames reached her heavily loaded ammunition magazines, resulting in massive, catastrophic secondary explosions that completely gutted the ship, sending another irreplaceable pillar of the Japanese fleet to the depths. In a single afternoon, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 2 of its largest, most capable fleet carriers not to aircraft, but to the silent, lethal efficiency of the American submarine force. Unaware of the total destruction of his first two raids and deeply preoccupied with the terrifying torpedo attacks on his carriers, Admiral Ozawa stubbornly, desperately ordered the launch of his third and fourth raids in the early afternoon. The third raid, consisting of 47 aircraft, was poorly coordinated and received incorrect navigational data. They failed to locate the massive American fleet entirely. In a desperate attempt to salvage the mission, they turned toward the Marianas, intending to land on the airfields of Guam to refuel. As they entered the airspace over Guam, they were immediately ambushed by dozens of American Hellcats that had been aggressively patrolling the area specifically to prevent such a maneuver. The Japanese planes, low on fuel and completely demoralized, were effortlessly swatted from the sky. Over 40 aircraft from the third raid were destroyed without inflicting a single scratch on the American forces. The fourth and final raid of the day, a massive strike package of 82 aircraft, was launched with equally flawed intelligence. The vast majority of these planes also failed to locate the Fifth Fleet. They, too, diverted to the supposedly friendly airfields on Guam. The American fighter direction officers, monitoring the Japanese radio traffic and radar tracks, gleefully vectored massive formations of Hellcats directly over the Guam airfields. The slaughter that ensued was absolute. As the Japanese aircraft lowered their landing gear and flaps, completely vulnerable and nearly out of fuel, the Hellcats dove upon them, ripping them to shreds with .50 caliber fire. Those Japanese pilots who miraculously survived the aerial ambush and managed to land their shattered planes on the cratered runways were immediately destroyed by American fighter bombers strafing the airfield. Of the 82 aircraft launched in the fourth raid, 73 were completely obliterated. As the sun began to set over the Philippine Sea on the evening of June the 19th, the firing finally ceased, and the terrifying, incomprehensible mathematics of the slaughter began to crystallize within the American command centers. The fighter direction officers, intelligence analysts, and squadron commanders meticulously tallied the combat reports. The numbers were staggering, bordering on the impossible. In a single day of combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost an estimated 350 to 400 aircraft. Over 300 highly trained, entirely irreplaceable Japanese aviators were dead. In stark, brutal contrast, the United States Navy had lost merely 30 aircraft, and due to massive, highly efficient air-sea rescue operations utilizing submarines and flying boats, the vast majority of the downed American pilots were safely recovered. It was an exchange ratio of annihilation, a mathematical demonstration of absolute, overwhelming industrial and technological supremacy that completely broke the offensive spirit of the Japanese military. The immediate aftermath of the battle, culminating in the American retaliatory strike the following day, further compounded the disaster for Japan. On the afternoon of June the 20th, American search planes finally located the retreating remnants of Ozawa's first mobile fleet. Despite the extreme range and the rapidly approaching darkness, Admiral Mitscher boldly launched a massive strike of over 200 aircraft, an operation that would become known as the Mission Beyond Darkness. The American aviators, pushing their aircraft to the absolute limits of their fuel capacity, engaged the surviving Japanese ships just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The American dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked the Japanese fleet, sinking the heavy carrier Hiowa and severely damaging several other warships. The true heroism of the American aviators occurred during the chaotic, terrifying return flight. Over 200 American aircraft, critically low on fuel, had to find their carriers in pitch-black darkness, a virtually impossible task under strict wartime blackout conditions. Defying all standard naval doctrine and risking submarine attack, Admiral Mitscher made a profoundly humane, immensely controversial decision. He ordered the entire American fleet to turn on their lights. Searchlights pointed vertically into the stratosphere, deck lights blazed, and star shells were fired to guide the desperate aviators home. Despite these extraordinary measures, over 80 American aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched into the dark ocean or crashed upon landing. However, the American logistical and rescue apparatus was so overwhelmingly efficient that over 70% of the crews from the ditched aircraft were successfully rescued from the water over the following days. The loss of American aircraft was essentially a logistical inconvenience, easily replaced by the massive, untouched reserves waiting on escort carriers in stateside factories. For the Japanese, the loss of 400 aircraft and their crews was a catastrophic, unrecoverable strategic death blow. When the deeply sanitized, heavily censored combat reports finally reached Tokyo, the reaction within the Supreme High Command was one of profound, paralyzing shock and deep-seated terror. The Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle that the Imperial Japanese Navy had relentlessly trained for, sacrificed for, and based their entire strategic doctrine upon, had finally occurred, and it had resulted in the complete, humiliating annihilation of their naval air power. The Japanese leadership realized, with terrifying clarity, that the technological gap between their military and the United States was not merely wide, it was a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The Zero fighter, once a symbol of imperial dominance, had been brutally exposed as a fragile, obsolete death trap. The American industrial machine, producing advanced radar, proximity fuses, and thousands of heavily armored Hellcats, had completely eclipsed the Japanese capacity to wage modern aerial warfare. The loss of the Marianas was now an absolute, unavoidable certainty. The strategic implications were catastrophic. Within weeks, the American forces would secure Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, immediately beginning the construction of the massive airbases that would launch the B-29 firebombing raids that would systematically reduce Japanese cities to ashes. The political fallout in Tokyo was swift and ruthless. General Hideki Tojo, the prime minister and absolute architect of the Pacific War, was forced to resign in disgrace, his credibility entirely shattered by the massive defeat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea fundamentally altered the psychology of the Japanese military command. Recognizing that they could no longer compete in conventional aerial combat, that their remaining pilots lacked the skill to survive even a minute against the American Hellcat swarms, the Japanese military apparatus descended into a grim, fatalistic nihilism. They abandoned all pretense of conventional naval aviation doctrine. The loss of 400 planes in a single day provided the irrefutable, macabre logic that led directly to the institutionalization of the kamikaze, the deliberate, state-sponsored deployment of suicide tactics. If a Japanese pilot was virtually guaranteed to be shot down before he could release his bombs conventionally, the Japanese logic dictated that the pilot must become the guidance system for the bomb itself, deliberately crashing his aircraft into the American warships. The Marianas Turkey Shoot was the violent, fiery crucible that forced the Japanese Empire to transition from a conventional military power into an apocalyptic, suicidal defense force, forever altering the trajectory of the Pacific War and sealing the ultimate, devastating fate of the Japanese nation.